My name is Helen Marshall. I'm 72 years old, a retired history teacher from a small town in Missouri. I always believed that family meant support and respect. But one day, I accidentally discovered that my children and grandchildren had already begun planning my future farewell, while I was still very much alive and perfectly healthy. They even discussed who would get what. I stayed silent. I listened. And then I shattered their plans. If this story resonated with your soul, click subscribe and let me know in the comments which city or country you're listening from. I'm truly curious to know where you're tuning in from. My name is Helen Marshall. I was 72 years old when the cracks in my peaceful life began to show, though at the time I didn't recognize them for what they were. I had lived in the same small town in Missouri my entire life. After teaching high school history for nearly 40 years, I had finally retired, trading chalkboards and lesson plans for slow mornings and long afternoons, filled with the kind of quiet that once felt like a distant dream. I lived alone in a modest white house with blue shutters that my late husband, Frank, and I had bought together when we were first married. The house had seen decades of laughter, sorrow, celebration, and stillness. The wooden floors creaked under familiar paths. The kitchen smelled faintly of cinnamon and old recipes, and the front porch swing groaned in the breeze like an old friend telling stories of years gone by. My days were simple, but full. I woke up early, just as I had during my teaching years, unable to break the habit of greeting the day before the world truly stirred. I brewed a pot of strong coffee, poured it into my favorite chipped mug, and sat by the window watching the mist lift off the fields behind my house. I spent hours tending my garden, tomatoes, roses, a stubborn patch of lavender that refused to grow straight no matter how carefully I pruned it. On Wednesdays, I volunteered at the library, shelving books and reading aloud to children who listened with wide eyes and restless legs. On Sundays, I attended the small Methodist church down the road, where the pews were filled with familiar faces and the hymns rang out like old promises still kept. My children, Susan and David, lived in the city now, about an hour's drive away. They visited on holidays, called when they remembered. I didn't mind. I told myself it was natural. They had their own lives, careers, mortgages, children of their own. I never wanted to be a burden, never wanted them to feel obligated to spend time with me out of guilt. I cherished the moments we did have, rare as they sometimes were. Susan was a corporate attorney, sharp and driven, her voice always clipped and efficient on the phone, as though squeezing our conversations into the spaces between conference calls. David worked in finance, his days swallowed by numbers and deadlines. They were good children, successful, responsible. I was proud of them. I had raised them to be strong and independent, and they had become exactly that. My grandchildren were another story. Busy, distracted, always in motion. I rarely saw them outside of birthdays and Christmas, and even then, their eyes were often more focused on their phones than on the world around them. I tried not to take it personally. Times were different, people were different. Despite the distance, I believed we were a family stitched together by invisible threads, bound not by proximity, but by love, by history, by the countless small moments that had built a life. I believed that deep down they cared. I lived modestly. My retirement savings were sufficient, carefully managed after years of financial prudence. I owned my home outright, had no debts, no secret worries. I was healthy for my age, arthritis in my hands, yes, and a slight limp on rainy days, but nothing that kept me from tending my roses or baking a batch of cookies when the mood struck. Neighbors often told me how lucky I was, how rare it was to find a woman of my years so self-sufficient, so vibrant. I smiled and thanked them, but inside I knew it wasn't luck. It was a lifetime of discipline, of careful choices, of setting priorities and sticking to them even when the world demanded something else. In the evenings, I would sit on the porch with a blanket draped over my knees, a book resting on my lap, and watch the sun dip behind the trees. The horizon would blaze gold and pink, and for a few precious minutes, the world felt stitched together by something holy. I would close my eyes, breathing in the scent of earth and fading sunlight, and feel at peace. This was the life I had built. Quiet, steady, honest. It never occurred to me that anyone would see it differently. It never crossed my mind that the very people I had loved most, the people I had spent a lifetime nurturing and protecting, might one day see my life not as something sacred, but as something to be managed. At the time, I was blissfully unaware. I still looked forward to their visits, planned little meals in advance, bought their favorite cookies, and made sure the house was warm and inviting. I still believed in the old lessons, that if you gave love, you would receive it in kind. I was wrong, but on those early winter mornings, before the first real betrayal revealed itself, I lived in the sweet, fragile calm of a woman who had done everything right and trusted that rightness would be enough. It was a beautiful lie, and for a while longer, I allowed myself to believe it. It was a crisp Saturday afternoon when I first heard the words that would fracture the world I had so carefully built around myself. The sun was high but thin. The light diffused through the brittle branches of trees that had long since shed their autumn colors. I had been invited to a small birthday gathering for an old friend, Martha, a woman I had known since our children were in kindergarten. It was one of those modest celebrations we older women had learned to cherish, simple, genuine, untouched by the need to impress. Martha's granddaughter had offered to host the party in her suburban home. It was a pleasant enough place, too large for her small family, with an open-concept kitchen that gleamed with stainless steel appliances and spotless marble countertops. I brought a homemade pecan pie, wrapped carefully in a basket, and wore my best navy cardigan, the one with the pearl buttons. The gathering was modest, maybe 15 people in all. Most of us clustered in the living room, nursing cups of coffee or lemonade, exchanging polite, meandering conversation. The younger ones drifted in and out, checking their phones, laughing too loudly at jokes we didn't understand. I sat near the fireplace, savoring the warmth, when I overheard it. It wasn't meant for me. It wasn't even said maliciously, just casually, in that thoughtless way people speak when they think no one is really listening. Two young women were chatting just behind me. I recognized one of them as Martha's niece, and the other, only vaguely, was introduced as a friend of Susan, my daughter. They were talking about their plans for the coming summer, rattling off vacations, weddings, and family obligations. Then one of them mentioned Susan's name. I froze. "She's dealing with her mom's situation right now," the girl said, lowering her voice only slightly. "They've already started planning, just in case. It's kind of morbid, but smart, I guess. They don't want to be caught unprepared." I heard the other girl gasp, followed by a giggle. "Like a funeral and everything." "Yeah," the first one said, laughing under her breath. "Sorting out the will, too, dividing the stuff. I think Susan already picked out a few things she wants." The words hung in the air, heavier than the smoke from the fireplace. They moved on quickly to another topic, oblivious to the bomb they had dropped at my feet. I sat perfectly still, my hands wrapped tightly around my coffee cup, my smile frozen in place. My daughter, my son, planning my funeral, discussing my belongings, dividing my life into neat little packages while I was still here, still breathing, still capable of planting roses and baking pies and remembering every date in American history from the Revolutionary War onward. I felt a hollowness open up inside my chest, a cavern so deep It seemed to swallow the room's laughter and music and light. I struggled to breathe past the tightness gathering at the base of my throat. I stayed at the party for another hour, smiling, nodding, making small talk, pretending everything was fine. I hugged Martha goodbye, complimented her granddaughter on the decorations, and promised to call soon. When I stepped outside, the air slapped my face with its sharpness. I walked to my car slowly, each step mechanical. The pie plate, now empty, felt unbearably heavy in my hands. Driving home, I barely noticed the road. The familiar landmarks blurred into a haze. My mind churned, replaying the conversation again and again, dissecting every word, every careless laugh. I tried to tell myself it was a misunderstanding, that I had misheard, that surely they were speaking about someone else. But deep down, I knew better. I thought back to recent visits, how Susan had started asking more questions about the house, the will, my accounts, how David had seemed distracted, impatient, barely hiding his boredom when I talked about my plans for the garden or the library, how neither of them had asked about my health in any real way, but had asked, pointedly, about my long-term care plans. It had been there all along, hadn't it? I just hadn't wanted to see it. I pulled into my driveway as the first stars blinked into existence overhead. My house, usually so welcoming, seemed unfamiliar in the gathering dusk. I sat behind the wheel for a long time, the engine ticking as it cooled, staring at the front porch where the swing still swayed gently in the breeze. When I finally climbed out of the car, I moved slowly, every joint aching with the weight of a truth I could no longer deny. Inside, I placed the empty pie plate in the sink and stood there, staring out the kitchen window into the darkness. I thought about the conversations my children must have had without me, meetings, texts, discussions about funeral homes, about dividing up the china and the jewelry, about who would take what. And not once had they thought to involve me, to ask me what I wanted, to recognize that I was still here, still capable of making my own decisions, still deserving of the dignity they were so ready to strip away. I felt grief then, not for my death, which would come in its own time, but for the death of an illusion, the belief that love was enough to guarantee respect, that loyalty was automatic, that family would always see you as a person, not a possession. I was wrong, and standing there, with the cold kitchen tiles beneath my feet and the night pressing against the windows, I made a decision. I would not confront them. I would not plead for recognition. Instead, I would reclaim what was mine, my choices, my voice, my legacy. They had made their plans. Now it was time for me to make mine. The next morning, I woke up long before the sun had risen, the familiar shape of my bedroom cast in heavy shadows. I lay there staring at the ceiling, feeling a strange numbness settle over me, a dull, throbbing ache that reached deeper than any physical pain I had known. It was the kind of ache that came not from injury, but from betrayal, the slow, corrosive kind that eats away at the foundation of everything you once believed was solid. The house around me creaked as it always did before dawn, settling into itself, breathing in that deep, heavy way old houses do when the world outside is still sleeping. I listened to the sounds and thought about how long I had lived within these walls, how many birthdays, Christmases, school plays, and graduations they had witnessed. Every photograph on the wall, every nick in the woodwork, every scratch on the floor told a story of the life I had poured into my family. And yet, despite all that history, despite all that love, my children had decided it was time to start dismantling it without me. For a while, I lay completely still, as if moving would somehow make the truth heavier, more real. Then, finally, with effort that seemed disproportionate to the simple act, I swung my legs over the side of the bed and stood up. My knees cracked in protest, but I ignored them. I moved through the motions of my morning routine with mechanical precision. I brewed coffee, fed the birds outside with stale bread I had saved, watered the plants that lined the kitchen windowsill. These small rituals had always brought me peace, grounding me in the rhythm of a life well lived. But that morning, they felt hollow, like echoes of a song I no longer remembered the words to. I sat at the kitchen table with my coffee growing cold between my hands, staring at the garden through the glass. The roses were withered now, their blooms reduced to brittle husks by the early frost. Only the stubborn lavender remained green, bending against the chill wind but refusing to break. It struck me then how much I was like that lavender, bent, weathered, perhaps no longer beautiful in the way I once had been, but still standing. Still here, I thought about confronting Susan and David, about demanding an explanation, forcing them to look me in the eye and admit what they had done. Part of me craved that vindication, the chance to hear them stumble over excuses and shallow apologies. But another stronger part of me knew better. They wouldn't see what they had done as betrayal. They would frame it as pragmatism, as care, as responsibility. They would tell themselves and me that they were only trying to prepare, to spare me trouble later, to protect my legacy. They would not see the arrogance in planning my death before I had finished living. They would not understand the violence of reducing a life to a checklist. I realized then that seeking an apology would only leave me more hollow, not less. The shock of that understanding sat heavy in my chest, a weight that would not lift no matter how many deep breaths I took. I was on my own in this, and maybe I always had been, in ways I had never allowed myself to see. The sooner I accepted that truth, the sooner I could begin to act from a place of strength, not wounded pride. I rose from the table and moved through the house slowly, touching the edges of picture frames, running my fingers across the spines of books I had read and loved, tracing the worn arms of chairs that had cradled so many quiet evenings. This was my life, not a collection of assets, not a series of future transactions waiting to be executed. A life. And it was not over yet. I pulled out a legal pad from the desk in the living room and sat down with a pen. I wrote a list, not of possessions or bequests, but of intentions. I would rewrite my will. I would safeguard my home, my finances, my independence. I would decide what happened to my things, not because I wanted to spite anyone, but because I deserved to have a say in the narrative of my own life. I would not let the end of my story be written without me. I would reclaim my place as the author of my own life, even if it meant upsetting the very people I loved most. Acceptance, I realized, was not surrender. It was clarity. And from that clarity, I could move forward, not with bitterness, not with anger, but with the quiet, unshakable certainty that my life was still mine, and I would not let anyone take it from me. The next morning, I awoke with a sharpness I hadn't felt in years. The sadness was still there, tucked into the corners of my chest like a stubborn shadow, but it no longer paralyzed me. It had solidified into something useful, something that could anchor me instead of drown me. I had spent enough hours mourning the betrayal. Now it was time to protect what was mine. After breakfast, I sat down with my coffee and my legal pad, the list from the night before staring back at me. I added to it carefully, deliberately, thinking through each step. I knew better than to rush. Haste leads to mistakes, and mistakes were something I could not afford when the stakes were this high. First on the list was finding a new lawyer. I had always used the same small-town attorney for routine matters, wills, property deeds, tax questions, But now I needed someone sharper, someone who specialized in elder law, in asset protection, in safeguarding people from exactly the kind of quiet theft my children had begun to orchestrate. I spent the better part of the morning researching firms in the nearest city, reading reviews, making notes. By lunchtime, I had selected a name, Margaret Chen. She had a reputation for being meticulous, discreet, and utterly relentless when it came to protecting her clients. I called her office and scheduled an appointment for the following Thursday. It felt good to act. Next, I turned my attention to my financial accounts. I reviewed every bank statement, every investment portfolio, every insurance policy. I compiled everything into a binder, neatly labeled color-coded tabs marking each section. I wanted to walk into Margaret's office with a complete map of my financial life laid out in front of her, leaving no room for confusion or hesitation. I also made copies of everything and stored them in a safe deposit box at my bank, one that only I could access. It was a simple precaution, but one that made me feel immediately stronger, as if I had taken a piece of my life and tucked it out of reach from prying hands. In the afternoons, I began sorting through my physical possessions. I went room by room, closet by closet, drawer by drawer. I made decisions about what mattered to me and what did not. Some things, photographs, heirlooms, small treasures from my travels, I set aside for safekeeping. Other items, the ones I no longer needed or wanted, I boxed up for donation. It was strangely liberating, this process of curation. It reminded me that my life was not defined by the accumulation of objects, but by the memories and choices those objects represented. In the evenings, I allowed myself to dream a little. If I no longer needed to leave my estate to Susan and David, what could I do instead? I thought about the causes that mattered to me: education, literacy, community gardens, small local charities that struggled to survive. I pictured a scholarship fund for students who loved history as much as I had. I imagined a donation to the local library for a new children's reading room. I envisioned small acts of legacy that would live beyond me, not as grudging inheritances, but as gifts freely given. Each idea filled me with a quiet, steady joy. They had thought they could plan my ending for me, but I was just beginning a new chapter. By Wednesday, I had drafted a letter to Margaret outlining my intentions. I wanted a living trust, not just a will. I wanted clear stipulations about my property and accounts. I wanted an independent executor, someone with no personal ties to my family, who would ensure my wishes were honored without interference or manipulation. And most importantly, I wanted every document protected by layers of legal fortifications that Susan and David could not breach without exposing themselves. It wasn't about revenge. It was about reclaiming agency. It was about drawing a line and daring them to cross it. On Thursday morning, I dressed carefully for my meeting: a simple gray skirt, a pressed blouse, low-heeled shoes. I pinned my hair back neatly, applied a touch of lipstick, and looked at myself in the mirror. The woman staring back was not fragile. She was not confused or vulnerable or lost. She was prepared. I drove into the city with the binder beside me on the passenger seat, the morning sun slicing through the windshield and warming my hands. I felt a sense of purpose that vibrated through every nerve, as if my very blood had remembered how to move with intention again. Margaret's office was in a modest building downtown. No glossy skyscrapers, no showy marble foyers, just clean lines, polished wood, and an air of quiet competence. Her assistant greeted me warmly and offered coffee, but I declined. I wanted my mind sharp. Margaret herself was a small woman in her early 50s, with sharp eyes and a handshake that conveyed immediate respect. She listened without interrupting as I laid out everything: what I had overheard, what I suspected, what I wanted. When I finished, she smiled slightly and said, "You're doing exactly the right thing." We spent the next 2 hours reviewing options, crafting strategies, building protections. By the time I left her office, a thick packet of preliminary documents tucked under my arm, I felt lighter than I had in months. Driving home, the fields stretched out on either side of the highway, golden and bare under the late autumn sky. I rolled down the window, letting the cool air rush in, filling my lungs with something clean and bright and new. They had made their plans. Now I had made mine. And this time, the ending would be written by my own hand. The process of changing everything I had built over a lifetime moved more quietly than I had expected. There were no grand declarations, no dramatic shifts visible to the outside world. Instead, it unfolded in steady, deliberate steps, each one hidden beneath the ordinary rhythms of my days. After my first meeting with Margaret, we set a plan into motion. Every Wednesday morning, I drove into the city to sit with her in her modest office, reviewing documents, signing papers, asking questions until every clause and detail was clear to me. There were new trusts to establish, titles to reassign, beneficiaries to update. Every account I owned was redirected, locked down, layered with protections so dense that no amount of persuasion or guilt would ever untangle them. It was a strange feeling, dismantling the plans I had once made so lovingly for Susan and David. Years ago, when Frank and I first drafted our wills, it had seemed so simple, so natural to imagine everything we had built passing seamlessly to our children. Back then, it had been an act of hope, of trust. Now, each signature, each notarized document was an act of survival. I didn't tell anyone what I was doing. When Susan called, usually rushed between meetings, I answered warmly, keeping my tone light, discussing trivial things, the weather, a recipe I had tried, the progress of my winter garden. When David stopped by one Sunday afternoon, bearing store-bought pastries and a hollow smile, I made coffee and listened as he talked about work, about how busy life was, about how exhausting it all could be. He didn't mention anything about wills or future plans. Neither did I. I let them believe that everything was exactly as it had always been. In truth, it had never been more different. Late at night, after the last cup of tea was finished and the last lamp switched off, I sat at my dining room table with copies of the new documents spread out before me. I read every word, every condition, every safeguard. My home was now held in a living trust with explicit instructions that it could not be sold or mortgaged without the trustee's consent. A trustee who was a professional, a stranger to my children, immune to their charms or tears. My savings accounts were similarly shielded, with clear disbursement instructions that prioritized charitable donations to causes I had long supported but never had the means to impact while raising a family. Scholarships for underprivileged students, grants for rural libraries, endowments for environmental projects in my state. Pieces of my life sent forward into futures that had nothing to do with bloodlines or last names. There were times when a flicker of guilt gnawed at me, not because I doubted the righteousness of what I was doing, but because the old part of me, the part that had spent decades believing that motherhood meant endless sacrifice, still recoiled at the idea of putting my needs above my children's desires. That old voice whispered insidiously late at night, reminding me of Susan's first steps, David's graduation, the family vacations scraped together on a teacher's salary, and Frank's modest pension. But I silenced that voice with a firmer, clearer one. The woman who had raised those children, who had patched scraped knees and stayed up late editing college essays, deserved respect, not exploitation. Love that demanded blind surrender was not love, it was a transaction. and I was done participating in transactions that cost me my dignity. Each secret change, each private meeting with Margaret felt like another brick laid in the fortress around my life. A fortress built not to shut the world out, but to preserve the life I had fought so hard to create. I learned to carry these changes inside me like a hidden fire, warming my steps even as the outside world continued unchanged. Neighbors still waved from their porches. The mail still arrived each morning, a mix of catalogs and utility bills. Church services still opened with familiar hymns, and the grocery store still smelled faintly of coffee and bleach. Life went on, as it always had, but I was different. I moved through my days with a secret strength, a quiet certainty that no matter what storms might come, no matter what demands or expectations might be laid at my feet, I was no longer vulnerable in the ways that truly mattered. Sometimes I would catch my reflection in a window as I walked through town, a small, unassuming woman with gray hair and kind eyes, and I would smile to myself. Let them see the softness. Let them assume it meant weakness. The real changes were invisible, buried deep where no one could touch them. In late December, as the town prepared for Christmas, Susan called to invite me to a family dinner. I accepted, keeping my voice cheerful, making a mental note to bring my famous apple pie. There would be laughter and small talk and perhaps another subtle inquiry into my plans, framed innocently as concern. I would smile, thank them, and change the subject. They thought they knew everything. They thought they were preparing for my ending, but only I knew the truth. I was preparing for my beginning. The family dinner was scheduled for a Saturday evening, just after the new year. Susan insisted on hosting it at her house, a sprawling suburban home with polished hardwood floors and an open-plan kitchen that always smelled faintly of lemon polish. I agreed to come, bringing my apple pie in the same old ceramic dish I had used for decades. There was a familiarity to the ritual that steadied me as I drove down the highway, past bare winter fields and quiet neighborhoods dusted with frost. When I arrived, the house was already filled with the soft hum of conversation, the clatter of dishes, the occasional burst of laughter. Susan greeted me at the door with a brisk hug, air kissing my cheek before whisking the pie away to the kitchen. David was there too, his smile polite, his eyes a little too calculating when he looked at me. We gathered around the dining table, laden with roast beef, potatoes, green beans, and a kale salad that no one really touched. Conversation flowed easily enough at first, the usual small talk about work, school, and the weather. I listened more than I spoke, noting the way Susan and David occasionally exchanged glances, silent communications that passed too quickly for anyone else to catch. Dessert came and went. Plates were cleared, coffee was poured, and then, as I sipped from my cup, Susan folded her hands neatly on the table and leaned forward slightly, her voice dropping into a tone that tried to sound casual. "We've been thinking," she said, "about making things a little easier for you this year." David nodded, his expression carefully composed, as if he were preparing to deliver a presentation at work rather than speak to his mother. Susan continued, outlining a proposal that had clearly been rehearsed. "They wanted to help me organize my affairs," she said. "It was all about preparation, about making sure things were in place." She used words like streamline and simplify, as if my life were a cluttered closet they needed to clean out for my own good. She smiled when she said it, the kind of smile people reserve for children who don't know what's best for them. David chimed in, mentioning that they had already contacted an estate lawyer, someone who could smooth the process and ensure no loose ends. They had even drawn up some preliminary paperwork just to get a head start, just in case something happened unexpectedly. I sat perfectly still, my hands wrapped around my coffee cup, the ceramic warm against my palms. Susan reached into her handbag and pulled out a folder, the kind of folder you use when you want something to look official but not intimidating. She placed it on the table between us with a practiced gentleness, as if offering a gift. Inside, I knew, would be documents transferring power of attorney, access to my accounts, authority over my home, my health care, my final arrangements. They were smiling. They were so sure of themselves. I smiled back. I thanked them for their concern. I placed my hand on the folder, sliding it closer, pretending to study it while my heart hammered against my ribs. I asked a few polite questions, careful not to reveal the anger rising inside me like a slow, unstoppable tide. I nodded thoughtfully, as if considering their suggestions, as if I were touched by their care. In reality, every word they spoke confirmed what I had already known. This was not about love. This was about control, about convenience, about tying up my life neatly so that they could move on with theirs, unburdened. They weren't preparing to help me. They were preparing to erase me. After a few minutes, I closed the folder and smiled again, thanking them sincerely for their thoughtfulness. I promised I would review everything carefully, that I would think about it. They seemed satisfied with that, relieved even. Susan poured more coffee. David leaned back in his chair, already confident that the matter was settled. They didn't know that the ink had already dried on a different set of documents, documents that locked them out of everything they thought they were about to inherit. Documents that placed my future and my legacy firmly in my own hands. I stayed for another hour, chatting about innocuous things, complimenting Susan's new curtains, asking David about his latest project at work. I laughed when appropriate, nodded when expected. By the time I left, the winter night had deepened, the stars sharp and cold against the dark sky. I drove home slowly, savoring the quiet, the feeling of the steering wheel under my hands, the knowledge that I was still in control of my own journey. At home, I set the folder they had given me on the kitchen table. I didn't open it again. I didn't need to. Its contents were irrelevant now, a final insult that had arrived too late to do any real harm. I made myself a cup of tea and sat by the window, watching the moon rise over the bare trees. I thought about how easy it would have been to slip into anger, to confront them, to shout and accuse and demand apologies they would never truly mean. But anger, I realized, was a gift I no longer intended to give them. Silence was stronger. Control was quieter. They had planned a future where I was helpless, where I needed them to navigate the end of my life. Instead, I had built a future where I remained sovereign, untouchable, free. Their surprise had been unpleasant, but my response would be something they never saw coming. The days that followed were sharp and brittle, like the cold wind that swept across the empty fields outside my windows. Winter had settled fully into Missouri, the trees stripped bare, their black branches scratching against the pale gray sky like fingers searching for something lost. I found myself moving through my routines with a clarity that surprised me, a steady resolve that made even the coldest mornings feel somehow manageable. Susan called first. Her voice was bright, overly so, like a woman whistling in the dark. She asked if I had had a chance to look over the documents they had left with me, if I had any questions. I told her I was still considering everything carefully, that such decisions took time. She seemed disappointed but masked it with polite encouragement, telling me there was no rush, that they just wanted what was best. I could almost hear the strain in her voice, the impatience pressing against the edges of her words. David texted later that night. A short message, just checking in. Hope you're well. Let us know if you need anything. I stared at it for a long moment before replying with a simple, thank you. I'm doing fine. The cold wind rattled the windows that night, and I pulled my blanket tighter around my shoulders, feeling the old house sigh and creak against the gusts. I thought about the years I had spent believing that love was a kind of shelter, that family was a place you could return to, no matter how hard the world became. Now I realized love without respect was no shelter at all. It was a leaky roof, a crumbling wall, a door that slammed shut when you needed it most. At church that Sunday, people asked about my family. I smiled and nodded, telling them everything was wonderful, that Susan and David were busy, successful, happy. I didn't mention the folder tucked away in my desk drawer, the new trust documents hidden safely in my safe deposit box. I didn't tell them about the silence that had grown between us, thicker and heavier with each passing day. Some things were too private to lay bare even in the warmth of community. One afternoon, as I sat on the porch bundled in my heavy coat, I watched a pair of children playing in the snow across the street. Their laughter carried easily on the frigid air, unburdened and pure. I closed my eyes for a moment and let the sound wash over me, remembering when my own children had been that small, that joyful before ambition and disappointment had hardened them into people I barely recognized. It would have been easy to let bitterness take root. It would have been easy to see myself as a victim, to sit in judgment over them from the high perch of my own wounded pride. But I had never been one to choose the easy road. Instead, I focused on the small freedoms I had carved out for myself, the new charities I supported, the letters I had written to organizations that would someday carry pieces of my legacy forward, the books I had begun reading simply because they intrigued me, not because they were practical or approved. The wind grew colder as January dragged on, a relentless, howling presence that battered the house and stripped the last leaves from the stubborn bushes along the fence line. I welcomed it. The cold was honest. It didn't pretend to be warm. It didn't dress itself up in false smiles or empty gestures. It was what it was, and it demanded nothing more than resilience in return. Susan and David tried again the following week. Another phone call, this time from David, more direct. He spoke of timelines, of legalities, of how important it was to secure my future before it became an emergency. I listened without interrupting, my heart steady, my mind clear. When he finished, I thanked him again for his concern and told him I was handling everything according to my own plans. There was a long silence on the other end of the line, a silence heavy with things he wanted to say but knew better than to voice. We ended the call with strained pleasantries, the kind of hollow words that fill the space where real connection used to live. Afterward, I sat by the fire and watched the flames dance, thinking about how little it took for relationships to change, how quickly trust could be eroded by fear and selfishness. The cold wind howled outside, pushing against the windows, rattling the old door frames. I let it howl. I wasn't afraid of it anymore. I knew who I was. I knew what I had built. And no matter how the world outside battered against the walls of my life, I had fortified myself from within. They could plan all they wanted. They could push and prod and plead. But I had already made my choice, and that choice was final, as unyielding as the winter wind. February arrived with a brittle kind of beauty, the kind where the sky stayed pale all day and the earth seemed to sleep under a thin crust of frost. I moved through those quiet weeks with a sense of finality I had never known before, a certainty that no matter how the world around me shifted, my course was set. The final documents were delivered to my house in a thick envelope with Margaret's firm's return address printed neatly in the corner. I opened it carefully, my hand steady, and spread the papers out across the dining room table. Each page bore the mark of my decisions, each clause a reminder that my life, my future, My legacy belonged to me and me alone. I signed the final forms with the same pen I had used to sign my first teaching contract decades earlier. Somehow it felt fitting, as if one era of my life was reaching back to shake the hand of the woman I had become. When I finished, I sealed the documents, placed them in the safe, and sat back in my chair, letting out a breath that felt as though it had been trapped in my chest for months. The house around me stood silent and strong, the walls thick with memories, the floors worn but faithful beneath my feet. I loved this house, not because of its monetary value or its size, but because of the life it had contained. Frank's laughter in the kitchen, Susan and David's muddy footprints across the hallway after soccer games, the scent of holiday dinners that had once drawn everyone home. Even now, with the cold outside and the distance inside my own family, the house felt alive, loyal in a way people sometimes forgot how to be. I spent my days as I pleased, unconcerned with expectations or guilt. I read long novels by the fire, baked bread that filled the rooms with warmth, walked slowly through my garden, imagining how it would bloom in the spring. I sent anonymous donations to the town library, the women's shelter, the community food bank. Small acts of kindness, deliberate and private. Susan and David continued to call occasionally, their voices threaded with false cheer, careful not to press too hard. They were waiting, I realized, still holding on to the belief that I would eventually fall back into old habits, that I would forget the cold wind that had taught me who I truly was. But I remembered. I remembered the folder placed between us on Susan's table, the smiles that had not reached their eyes, the plans whispered without my knowledge or consent, and I remembered the moment I chose to draw a line they could no longer cross. The invitations came for Easter, another family gathering, another chance to perform the roles we all knew by heart. I sent my regrets politely, citing health, though it was not sickness but clarity that kept me away. I spent that Sunday morning walking the trails behind my house, the frozen earth beginning to thaw, small shoots of green breaking through the ground. Life persisted, not in the ways I had once imagined, not through the neat continuation of bloodlines and heirlooms, but through stubborn, quiet growth, through the choice to live on my own terms, with my head high and my heart intact. One evening, sitting by the fire with a cup of tea warming my hands, I allowed myself to look back, not with bitterness, but with a kind of detached grace. I thought of all the versions of myself that had existed over the years: the eager young teacher, the busy mother, the grieving widow, the patient grandmother. Each one had given something away, had bent a little to fit the needs of others. But this version of myself, the woman sitting alone in the fading light, wrapped in peace like a second skin, had kept something for herself at last. She had refused to be a footnote in her own story. As the last embers crackled and the house settled deeper into night, I understood something I had never quite grasped before. An ending is not simply something that happens to you. It is something you write, word by word, choice by choice. I had chosen my ending, not one of fear, not one of silent surrender, but one of dignity, one of power, one of quiet, unshakable self-respect. And as the cold wind rattled the windows and the world outside spun on in its ceaseless rush, I sat in my chair, listening to the steady beat of my own heart, and smiled, because this ending was mine.